Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Defense One's Outlook 2022. I'm Kenney with Defense One, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this next interview session. But before we get started with the session, I have one quick housekeeping note for our audience. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the main stage chat function. This is where you can interact with your fellow attendees. Today, I am joined by Major General Joel Vowell, the commander of U.S. Army Japan, for a conversation about the challenges facing the Pacific region today and on the horizon as attentions and resources shift to Asia. So without further ado, let's begin. So Major General Vowell, some people in the Indo-Pacific as a region preferably see the region for operations involving the Navy and Air Force, not necessarily the Army. However, Army Secretary Warma said recently that the service is a linchpin for the joint force and listed 5 core tasks it could undertake if a conflict happens in the region. Can you talk more about the mission of U.S. Army Japan and how it factors into America's military and diplomatic presence in the region?
Sure, Caitlin, and thanks again for the opportunity. It's good to see you from here in Camp Itami. We're in the middle of a large interoperable exercise with Yamasakura 81, the largest command post exercise we do with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. And I'll talk more about what that means to answer your question more broadly. Let me begin by talking about the strategic environment and why we're here to begin with. And then we'll talk about what we do and what that way forward is. If you take a look across the geography of the Indo-Pacific and where we are in the first island chain outside the continent of Asia, you've got 3 aggregated threats, potential adversaries, but certainly not governments acting in the best behalf of their own people or in the rules-based international order. They are Russia, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, and the People's Republic of China. Historically, U.S. Army Japan has been tied more to the defense of the Republic of Korea, the South Koreans, and we've done a lot in the decades since World War II in that vein to help provide that common defense in Japan. During the Cold War, the focus was defense of Japan on Russia's influence to the north, not so much with where we are today with North Korea and China. In the last decade or so, with North Korea's capabilities to test and launch sea, air, and intercontinental ballistic missiles and threaten the region, there's been much more of a focus on what that deterrence needs to be to include ballistic missile defense with Japan as one mission. That's one of the things that we do in U.S. Army Japan to help them. But just really in the last 10 to maybe 5 years, there's been an acknowledgement of just the exponential growth of military capabilities that the People's Republic of China have fielded. And it's pretty inspiring in 20 years what they've been able to do with their armed forces, with the production of, on scale, first world capabilities in space, in the maritime domain, in the air domain, cyber domains, electronic warfare, information warfare. They've taken a lead from what the United States has done with technology and quite frankly, our joint doctrine, done a lot to copy and emulate that because they know that model works, but not to be used necessarily in a good way. And so the fundamental thing we do here in U.S. Army Japan today is assuring our allies in Japan that we're here with them for the defense of Japan. That's probably point one. And I would say the rest of what we do is scalable, deterrence against those potential adversaries and aggressors in the region. I won't go into too much specifics, but I think if you're tracking what's happening in the South China Seas, around the waters around and airspace around Taiwan, you can see where the People's Republic of China has not been very judicious with their use of force. It's been pernicious, incremental, and insidious, trying to claim territories that may or may not have been historically theirs. But because they have all this weaponry now and this economic might, they're going to start using it against sovereign countries in ways that fall short of war right now. The coercion, the economic warfare, lawfare, and psychological warfare against the peoples who are sitting right off the coast of mainland China. So back to what we do now is U.S. Army Japan has a bunch of functions we do, and Secretary Warma probably talked about some of these core Army support to other services functions that we do. So United States Army Pacific, one of my higher headquarters, is a component for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. My other headquarters is United States Forces Japan, USFJ, a sub-unified command under Indo-PACOM and the Secretary of Defense. We are a component of USFJ, and so we help with USERPAC provide the theater signal capabilities that allow us to talk, share data across the theater for the Joint Force. The Army provides that. We provide theater military intelligence across the theater, intelligence operations that supports the Joint Force. Theater sustainment, the movement of logistics, equipment, personnel, material, intercontinental and intra. We're intra inside the first island chain where USERJ is. So we're the tail end of all that logistics that would happen for crisis and potential conflict. But in competition and peacetime and deterrence, routine exercising, the logistics sustainment footprint in case we need to. And there are other functions as well. I mentioned protection with air defense. That's a real one every day, primarily focused on North Korea for the defense of Japan. The other thing I would mention is in that defense of Japan, we exercise and engage with our Japanese partners constantly, persistently as U.S. Army Japan, as the partner who's always here. Now we bring on our friends from the rest of the U.S. Army, from the continental United States and other places. We've got 25th Infantry Division from Hawaii here right now, 100 feet from me right now, exercising in this command post exercise with Middle Army here in Osaka at Camp Atami. But we do this often throughout the year to provide scalable interoperability to where we grow our capacity and capabilities together. So U.S. Army Japan does a lot to establish the exercise framework for all of that. We do several exercises a year, from tactical to basically theater and higher operational levels of conflict. I'd say the other thing that U.S. Army Japan does is the mission command, or command and control portion, if you will, of those contingencies that can happen here in the region. We don't own a lot of the traditional maneuver forces like you would think of, like brigades and divisions and corps. We are the first thing that stands up in a crisis, and we are scalable until forces can flow in for whatever crisis that continues to escalate. And we have means and capabilities to manage escalation framework a little bit within the Joint Force, but larger elements can come forward, and that's the plan if we need to. But there's also crises and contingencies we are capable of responding to, and we have in the past. If you think humanitarian assistance, disaster response, United States Army Japan, in concert with one of our higher headquarters, United States Forces Japan, responded to the Fukushima Daiichi reactor meltdown in 2011 with the tsunami. So we responded with humanitarian assistance, engineers, aviation, and capabilities to help Japanese respond to that emergency. We've also done some localized disaster response with earthquakes and flooding over the years here in Japan as well. So we have that scalable option to assist the forces here. Lastly, I'd say the way ahead, leading to, what does it look like for the future of U.S. Army Japan? And I started to mention how China has risen militarily, at least, and certainly economically, to a near peer, almost peer competitor with the United States and the West, if you think of forces and capabilities and what that entails. We see that aggregated threat model of Russia, North Korea, and China, the problem and competition with the rules-based international order, authoritarian regimes acting on their own behalf, in contradiction to the values that the vast majority of the globe adhere to, especially our ally in Japan. And so we're here to help reinforce that rules-based international order, open markets, freedom of movement of peoples, free expression of ideas, etc. All that stuff from Bretton Woods that has underwritten how our international system works today. U.S. Army Japan has a piece of that with what we do with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. And so to help that deterrence in the future, the Army is investing in some capabilities. You may have heard of the Security Force Assistance Brigade. There's one brigade here in the Indo-Pacific, and their forces are here in Japan and several other countries right now. And they are designed to help train, advise, assist armies at different echelons, from tactical to operational, to become better at what I would describe as the understanding and application of the characteristics of 21st century warfare, not just the planning and the targeting process that we do militarily, but how do we get after the electronic warfare, the information warfare, the cyber issues, and potentially space effects. With a country like Japan, who has capabilities in those areas, how can they learn to apply them in concert with the traditional physical domains of maritime, air, land, etc.? So our SFAB right now is coaching and teaching these core or higher tactical echelons here in Japan a lot of how to think through those models, and they're very important work. They're persistently rotating through these countries to have touch points for them. So these countries like Japan increase their knowledge, skills, and abilities in a collective way where we just can't do it through episodic exercises through the year. The second one, the Army's contribution to the Joint Force, is a critical requirement. If you look at what all that military stuff that China has is there for, primarily anti-access area denial, A2AD, to push us further and further away from their sphere of influence militarily, economically, and coercively, diplomatically. So how do you deal with that problem? You create a force that is able to fracture open that area denial capabilities, their integrated air missile defense systems, their cyber capabilities, their C5 ISR capabilities. So there's an aperture that the Joint Force can maneuver through if they need to. The multi-domain task force is that animal. And so for several years, the Army has invested in testing, innovation, and creative logic on how to apply solutions to that problem. It's a unique formation, and it exists today. It's not on the whiteboard. Brigadier General Jim Eisenhower leads this organization out of JBLM in Washington, but he is constantly rotating capabilities through theater in Japan, through Guam, Australia, and they consist of cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, information, psychological operations, space capabilities, and they have lethal fires capabilities they're developing beyond what you think of today of cannon artillery, long-range cannon artillery, hypersonic vessels. Those are things the multi-domain task force is going to bring to bear to deal with the problem of anti-access and area denial. And so our Army, and the Secretary speaks about this quite eloquently, the Army's invested in what that task force is, and it'll be theater located, theater provided, theater assigned. And we see in Japan being a supporting and enabling command for them if and when they come forward to provide those capabilities from the first island chain. And we're already starting to see their exercises here. There's a cell here now in this exercise from the multi-domain task force helping the Middle Army and 25th ID do multi-domain targeting. So that's a long answer to a great question. I had to give you a strategic snapshot to kind of the Army's way of what they do here and the history behind that, USRJ, and then what I think that future is. And that's continuing to preserve the rules-based international order by our presence, our influence, our partnerships with Japan and their ground forces, so we can collectively deter against future aggression.
Great. No, thank you so much for that. I want to get to one of the recent stories out of the region. So Army Secretary Christine Wormuth recently mentioned China's hypersonic test, saying it went around the world and then hit a test target in China. How concerned are you about this test? And what are you hearing from allies in the region, including Japan?
Well, personally, I'm a little concerned only because, as I understand it, the same open source reporting, it orbited, went into an orbital flight where we couldn't really detect in certain parts of the globe where this went. And as I understand it, I don't think it hit its mark exactly, but that doesn't matter. It's still a test. And what it tells me as a military officer is China is determined to get some leap ahead capability or technology that's very lethal and can hold forces, formations at risk in a way that we can't deter. If you think about, I do, the similar model of placing tactical missiles in Western Europe in the late 70s and 80s against the Soviet Union, that was a game changer. The Soviets didn't predict that. We wanted to do that to much difference of opinion inside NATO, but it was going to cause a dramatic escalation potentially of the Soviet response with tactical missiles. And so that was kind of a start of negotiations, separate topic, of reducing some of the nuclear capabilities in Europe. But if we had a lot of tactical weapons everywhere, we definitely had some overmatch on the battlefield that the Soviet Union wasn't really anticipating. Maybe a similar analogy there with what this hypersonic test is. I think China's trying to do something that's game changing, my opinion, if what I read is correct. And if we can't detect it, intercept it, defeat it, like we can several, ICBMs maybe out of North Korea, it's a different technological problem that we're going to have to be dealing with.
But how concerned are you, and what are you hearing from Japan about this test and potentially future tests?
Well, I can tell you, I haven't heard much from Japan. So if you're asking if they came to be concerned about it, I don't know that because we've not had those conversations at my level. I can imagine my military peers, probably raised some eyebrows when they heard about it in the press because of the same reasons I raised mine. Like, wow, that's not a normal test. It's not a normal thing. It's something a little bit more advanced. So I don't have anything more than what the Japanese perception is because I just don't know.
And Secretary Wormuth also said that China has missiles that can reach Japan and Guam. There's also concern about, like you said, North Korea's missile tests and their nuclear capabilities. One of the core tasks that you had mentioned that Wormuth had talked about was the ability to provide integrated air and missile defense. What capabilities are there currently in Japan or in the region? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I could talk some of that, not quite all of it. I think for some obvious unstated reasons, but we do have Patriots here, batteries that are ready with different capabilities to detect and target, track, and intercept ballistic trajectory missiles from the continent of Asia. We have that capability here. We're not the only ones. So Japan and each of its services, Maritime Self-Defense Force has Aegis as well. So they have vertical launch systems and BMD capabilities very similar to the CRUDAS that our U.S. Navy has. So we're integrated there, point one. Point two, the Air Self-Defense Force, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, has Patriots to protect their airfields. So they have Patriot batteries as well with interceptors made by us for military sales that they have that work as well. So that's point two. Point three is the Army, the Ground Self-Defense Force has air defense as well, SHORAD, called SHU-SAM. So they have shorter range missiles for air defense as well for protection for some of the more tactical targets. So there's three levels of air defense Japan has, and they're part of the same picture that we, or solution, if you will, that we try to provide as well.
And what are some additional defensive measures that you believe need to be taken in the region to protect American allies and interests? I know that there had been some Iron Dome tests in Guam recently.
Yeah, yes, I think that's exactly right. So always looking at a way to improve our defeats capabilities against, all sorts of incoming missiles. A missile's not a missile. There's various types, various trajectories. So Iron Dome addresses a different type of missile, and I think our tests at Guam were designed to prove in principle what that can do. The Patriot and its capabilities are targeting a certain type of ballistic missile trajectory and set. And then we have, other capabilities that are sea launch that do others. And so the complementary system of integrated air and missile defense is supposed to work together. And so Iron Dome and potentially other capabilities, Aegis Ashore, will provide another layer of protection against threat missiles, DF-21s, DF-26s potentially from the PRC, which can range out to Guam. DF-26 certainly can. But there's a lot of them too. That's the other problem we have is the quivers of the People's Republic of China are very full with rocket forces and missiles. And we have to make sure we have enough to protect and intercept in case they're used. That's the nature of deterrence as well.
And how soon do you need these additional capabilities, do you feel?
tenuous with some capability the adversary has. Rather have overwhelming overmatch, either in offensive capabilities or defensive capabilities. And my personal assessment is I think we would need a little bit more defensive capabilities, because every day China's building more capabilities. North Korea is developing more of their program for nuclear capabilities. And then Russia has an intention to keep us out of the region too. So I believe they're looking at the same thing with producing more coastal defense cruise missiles that would keep us out of the northern parts of the Indo-Pacific potentially, or target U.S. or Japanese forces, or hold us at risk at least with those capabilities. So I don't think we have enough right now. I think we need more. And so that would be, as the commander of U.S. Army Japan, I think that would be something I would champion for, is more integrated air and missile defense protection in the first island chain for certain.
Great. And the recently approved Global Posture Review emphasized this relationship building with allies in the region, as well as enhancing the scale and scope of the military exercises, which is like what you're doing right now. So why are these exercises so crucial to the Army and the Joint Forces work in the region?
I guess my first bumper sticker answer to that question is you can't build trust at the line of departure or in crisis. You have to develop trust before that. So these engagements and exercises are doing that in being, because we're coming together, we're solving problems together. So trust is being developed at different echelons, from Army forces, I can speak to that, Army forces across the Indo-Pacific and the continental United States who come over here to exercise, and trust inside of Japan with the civil military apparatus, the Ministry of Defense, the government of Japan, and the ground self-defense forces themselves and their leadership. That persistent contact with these exercises has that effect, that trust is built. We know what they can do, they know what we can do. We're always coming here, we're always trying to help them, they're trying to inform us, and we're learning from them. That's a symbiotic truck mechanism, if there ever was one. That's an important point. I think these exercises also, by design in the scenarios, we thread through these scenarios, these difficult vignettes and situations where potential adversaries are looking for gaps and seams with their technology or their capability or their information warfare or their cyber that affect our ground movements and air movements and sea movements. So we have to account for these things in the war game and the exercise itself, in these command post exercises. That in turn informs how we go forward with our concepts to fight together and potentially changing the doctrine. I can speak for the Army, having watched the evolution of the Army's operating concept to multi-domain battle to now multi-domain operations as concepts. I'm pretty sure we're close to breakout for actual doctrine on how we bring these things together in convergence from different domains, physical and untethered domains, for effects at a time and space on the adversary, and that'll be new. Exercises like this highlight the need for that. Exercises like this show the adversary's capabilities that we're going to have to address it with multi-domain operations. And so I think that's a second important reason. The more we test, experiment, exercise together, we know and identify where we need to either improve our interoperability to fight better together, or we're going to have to address a capability that the adversary has that we need to evolve our concept, potential doctrine, or a capability technology that might be needed to provide the solution.
And what changes to the Army's posture do you hope to see over time? It seems like this is just the beginning of this discussion. Do you think that there should be more troops rotating through the region, or maybe potentially permanently based there? And what other like logistics and basing more equipment and supplies there?
That's a great question. I don't have insights to the exact global posture review. I think that's still classified, but I know what's been released is the holistic look that needed to happen as we finished up the missions in Afghanistan and mostly finished out in Iraq. We had so many forces committed to those missions and operations. It made sense to take a holistic look about what's needed in Europe, what's needed in the Indo-Pacific, what's needed in Latin and South America, et cetera, what's needed for the homeland defense in the continental United States, or the homeland of the territories and the states in the Indo-Pacific. I don't know the results of all that, to be honest with you. What I do know is what I've talked with my higher headquarters about was what you started to say there, the rotation of capabilities through the theater. So aside from the exercises evolving to address multi-domain operations, exercises involving the warfighting functions of protection, intelligence, movement and maneuver, sustainment, etc. All of our exercises are kind of scaling up to address those. But the frequency and the quality can be now metered better, I think, if we have more forces to rotate through the region to do that. The second thing rotating forces does for the Army and for the Indo-Pacific Commander, I believe, is it gives a different look to the adversary. We throw different packages that are not necessarily the same thing we have at the same time of year that's very predictable. We don't want to present that look. We want to present an unpredictable look. Maybe we change our exercise from a June to a September. And maybe that exercise, though is at the battalion level, does an entirely different objective in the next year. And maybe we move some fires elements with that we didn't the previous year. So that unpredictable nature of changing the quality, the episodic rotations that we have, and how it's perceived by the adversary is just one effect we have by doing this with potential global posture review. The obvious effect is, more touch points with our partners and our allies. I think we're all going to be better. Now, I would answer this question the other way. I don't think adding more forces, throwing a whole lot of what comes out of the Middle East and parking it right here in Japan is the answer. I don't. I think the Army and its contribution to the Joint Force is to continue to thicken the lines and our enabling conditions. The Army should provide the order of battle of the enemy's ground formations and to be able to provide indications of warnings and the intelligence support to do that. Thickening those lines in the intelligence architecture makes sense to me. The protection mechanism and warfighting function you mentioned with air defense, we've already covered that ground. That's another one as we experiment with Iron Dome and we look at other systems and capabilities, more THAAD capabilities, theater high altitude air defense, potentially because of the need for it. Those are potential opportunities to be stationed in Indo-Pacific. I don't know exactly where, but those are potential harvesting if that happens. I'll also say lastly, from Global Posture Review, if you ask Secretary Wormuth, I think she'd say, I assume she would, that one of the benefits is reset, regeneration, rearming of the force. The Army's been working pretty hard. I'm in the Army. It's been working pretty hard in the Middle East for the last 20 years. And so you need to reset, modernize, refit the formations where they're not on a constant rotational burn and churn supporting combatant commanders for the fight. There's an opportunity to be very smart and selective about how you employ rotational forces in competition for these exercises, like Pathways, the USAPAC's premier all-encompassing rubric of the exercises we do in Thailand, Philippines, Australia, Japan, and other countries. More opportunity to do that. But it doesn't mean that everything comes out of the Middle East and comes to Europe and comes to the Indo-Pacific. I think the Army needs to help modernize the systems and capabilities, and it needs to give units like some of our air defenders who have been deploying well under a year at home for another year, what we call a 0.9 dwell, where a lot of our soldiers are constantly on that churn of rotating for real world missions. I think the Secretary and the Chief would say that's a potential benefit for the Army, is let's modernize that force. Let's make it more multi-domain capable, and then let's employ it back out into the theaters. That might be another potential global posture review advantage for the Army.
Great. And so back here in Washington, the passage of the defense budget is facing delays in Congress. How do these delays and continuing resolutions affect our relationship and trust with allies in the region?
I don't know yet if continuing resolution delays had much effect here in Japan. I having lived through 2013 and some other times where we didn't have a budget or had a resolution and constantly going through, I'll tell you that's a huge effect on predictable funding, and predictable funding for readiness is that's the impact to U.S. Army and U.S. Army Japan if that were to happen. everything from furloughing the civilian workforce because we can't pay them or entitle them. We lose capability and readiness immediately when that happens, to not be able to drive because we can't buy fuel, fly because we can't buy fuel, all of the above. I think Japan has seen this with the United States, especially in the last couple of years, like we've lived it. They haven't voiced any great concern to me about it because we do the best we can as an Army to still be with them and train with them, and it hasn't been an impact to interoperability, readiness, or exercises that I know of so far. So I'd actually say I don't know if the people I work with don't really think about that. And believe me, Japan has its own interesting budgetary process as well. I think they think more about that more than how we have big potential challenges on budget process.
Thank you. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have this morning. Thank you, Major General Vowell, for sharing your time and insights with me today. It's always been a pleasure to speak with you.
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin. A privilege.
And to our audience, stay tuned throughout the day and this week as we bring you more riveting content during the rest of Defense One's Outlook 2022. Up next, we have a session with our elite underwriter.